He held the scissors like a conductor, golden, ceremonial, absurdly ornate for a conference room prop. The badge hung heavy from the black lanyard, titanium, weighty enough that it always brushed my sternum when I walked, the small metal imprint of almost every clearance I'd earned in 15 years. He smiled at the cameras. He said something about moving beyond badges. Then the blades came together with a single, crisp snap. He thought he was firing me. He triggered $5 billion. If you want to know what that looks like up close, imagine a room full of applause that evaporates like steam. Imagine the metallic scent of the badge and the faint chemical of conference room carpet. Imagine for a fraction of a second a mechanical silence that feels larger than the people making it. I remember the exact time, because we all have a time-stamped life in security now. 14:07:13 on the auditorium recorder. It froze in my head like a photographic negative. Where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments below, and if you like corporate drama told plainly, hit subscribe. This one's for people who believe competence should be loud enough to be heard over a ribbon cutting. I am Dr. Aries Thorne. For 15 years, I designed and defended the things people called unbreachable until they weren't. My office at Vanguard Systems sat below the boardroom, 2 floors under the polished marble of the executive suite, where the fluorescent light never reached and the servers hummed like a small tidal engine. People on the surface imagined security as an abstract checklist or the polite confidence of a locked door. In practice, it is heavy and inflexible as the hardware we trusted. The Class 7 token that hung from my lanyard was a continuous biometric tether. Not a badge, not an app, but a persistent physical credential that punctuated our contracts and our facility clearances. It felt private because it lived against my skin. It felt institutional because it unlocked more than doors. That titanium disc carried permissions that extended into encrypted stores and into contractual assurances with federal partners. When a facility clearance matters, the badge is not an accessory. It is a commitment made tangible, a promise between a contractor and the institutions that rely on the secrecy and availability of certain capabilities. You learn to carry that weight like a second uniform. The return of Kieran Hashford wasn't subtle. He landed at Vanguard with all the light and noise of a social media announcement. VP of Digital Innovation, his business card proclaimed, and his LinkedIn caricatures had more endorsements than anyone in his peer group deserved. He was Lawrence Ashford's son. That fact mattered in a million small, complicating ways. You could see it in the way people stood when he entered a room, an awkward, reflexive deference that had nothing to do with merit and everything to do with power. He had a new language: agile disruption, cloud first, user experience over legacy friction. His slide showed white clouds punctured by triumphant padlocks dissolving into light. He called it Project Velocity. For months before his arrival, the company had been a study in inertia. Engineers muttered about technical debt. Marketers sold transformation to boards that wanted press releases rather than architecture. Kieran's arrival animated something dormant. To those outside the engineering teams, Project Velocity was exhilarating. Slick videos, a staged town hall where actors in the marketing deck grinned at mock-ups of a world finally liberated from cumbersome hardware. To the people who touched the systems daily, it felt reckless, like painting over the stress fractures of a bridge with glossy enamel. I remember the town hall visuals down to the grain of the projector, a padlock dissolving into code, a smiling Kieran standing in front of an image labeled Future State, no badges. That line landed like the crack of a bat. He promised speed and simplicity, and crucially, the optics of innovation. He wanted a ribbon-cutting moment, the symbolic execution of a new era. The first time we spoke alone, it was in a glass-walled conference that Saturn rolled with houseplants and the faint smell of artisanal coffee. He was charming in the way the privileged often are, a practiced warmth that slides easily under caution. He said he wanted my support. I told him plainly what my work meant and why the hardware was there. I showed him the documentation, high level, not diagrams, because I do not break down primitives in casual conversation. I told him about facility clearance obligations, about how certain federal contracts treat physical control of keys and identity as a predicate to trust. He listened, smiled, and then he smiled some more in a different register. "You're conservative," he said. "We need to be bold." "You risk contracts," I said. "You're risk-averse," he said. "Your approach is theater, ours is scale." He didn't argue the law, he argued perception. For him, the badge was a theater prop, a relic to be cleverly disposed of on camera. I had seen that kind of thinking before. Optics over process, applause before consequence. Jared Frey was there one day, his face drawn into a map of unease. Jared was acting head of IT, competent, overtasked, and desperate for stability. He had been promoted past the point where he had the authority to say no. In private, he admitted things I want to record with care, that enterprise administrators had the technical levers to mute certain alarms, to reroute notifications, to change thresholds. Those leverings are not the same as a willful, malicious override. They're the blunt instruments of day-to-day operations used badly or without the philosophical guardrails they require. He described pressure, exhaustion, and a cultural tide that favored moving fast over the slow work of compliance. I did not accept that as inevitability. My refusal was bureaucratic, a set of notarized memos, a cold trail of emails, and a decision to ensure that if anyone tried to stage a spectacle, they could not plead ignorance afterward. I am not dramatic by nature. I am compulsive about documentation. The morning after Jared told me what he thought he could do, I drafted a memorandum. It was short, factual, legally framed. I signed it in my office, then took a physical copy down to Miriam Cole in General Counsel. Miriam is not the sort of person who flutters. She took the document, left for 10 minutes, and returned with a stamp and a placid face. I asked Miriam to notarize and archive a copy. I whispered to Mark in auditing to log the memo receipt. I left a copy where I knew an honest person would find it if things went sideways, taped under the inside of a door in the security office, with a sticky note that read simply, "If you are reading this, something's wrong." I BCC'd a secure administrative alias and put a paper copy in a locked file that was physically removed off-site. It wasn't paranoia, it was the equivalent of anchoring a ship in a storm. It is important to say this plainly. I did not set traps. I did not code booby traps into production systems. I put facts and dates where facts and dates could be found. When systems are politicized, paper has a way of outlasting rhetoric. The nervousness in the engineering teams simmered under the outward enthusiasm for Project Velocity. There were little things at first. Logs that flickered when they shouldn't. Alerts that arrived stripless and pale. A monitoring dashboard that suddenly stopped reflecting the entire scope of a service. Marcus, the lobby guard, complained that he'd seen senior staff escort devices around the building in padded envelopes late at night. Sarah in logistics began printing manifests and tucking them into pigeonholes. These are granular things. The tiny anomalies you only notice if you pay attention to the seams. I watched an odd pattern form. A subset of administrative accounts started initiating configuration requests that, on paper, read like small chores. A threshold change here, a notification suppression there. None of them individually would raise a regulator's eyebrow. The problem was the choreography. It felt like somebody rehearsing silence. At one point, Jared and I had a frank, private conversation. He was honest in his way. "They want a ribbon cut," he said. "They want the public to see progress. They don't care how we get there. They want it before quarter end." He used the word "we" reflexively, as if his own agency had folded into a larger corporate will. The melancholy in his voice was not about career so much as it was about the loss of a certain kind of professional dignity. He had been trained to be careful. Training had collided with pressure. I told him then what I had told Kieran only weeks before, that if anyone intentionally disabled controls or muted audit trails, it would not be a minor internal policy breach. It would change the legal texture of our contracts and our facility clearance. It would reach beyond Vanguard, into the agencies that had entrusted us with sensitive work. He looked down at his hands and said, "I know, I just don't know if I can hold them." The town hall was scheduled on a Thursday because it made for good press. The morning of, the executive suite smelled like espresso and lemon hand sanitizer. The stage was set with a lectern, a ring of photographers, and 3 rows of chairs for executives. The engineers were given rear seats. They sat in small groups like a congregation that knows the outcome of the service. Kieran arrived in a jacket cut for panels, the sort of blazer that announces several personal stylists and a budget for bold moves. Lawrence Ashford sat near the front. A presence felt more than heard. His jaw was a landscape of a man used to being the center of gravity. He watched his son in a way that most fathers watch their children on stages, with a cocktail of pride and distance. The optics were perfect. Marketing had arranged the moment as if it were a civic ritual. There would be a speech about innovation. There would be a retirement ceremony for the hardware, the lanyards, the tokens, the visible relics of the company's security posture. The plan called for a staged disposal, a ceremonial cutting of a badge to symbolize moving forward. Someone somewhere had thought, we will make our own history. It never occurs to those people that history has a way of answering back. I remember the lighting in the room dimmed as the cameras adjusted, that soft cinematic wash that advertisers love. Kieran's speech had all the right notes about speed and trust and the democratizing promise of no friction. He used the word legacy with a slight sneer. He spoke about agility and the fragile tyranny of hardware. People in the audience laughed politely, at least until the scissors appeared. I raised my hand. It was both instinct and protocol. I asked for a moment to speak, not to thwart ceremony, but to make one additional record. Miriam had insisted we register my objection in the minutes. The moderator, a woman with a headset and a schedule, hesitated, then nodded. I walked to the lectern with the feeling one gets before a small, necessary surgery, precise, calm, and aware of the potential for blood. My words were short. I spoke to the room about contractual obligations, about facility clearance predicates, about the fragility of trust. I did not say you will be prosecuted. I said instead that certain actions would trigger automated processes we had accepted as part of our risk posture.
I spoke about continuity, about the obligations we owe to partners who depend on our adherence to established controls. I did not murmur threat. I stated fact. The language could not be misread. You do not make veiled warnings when lives and livelihoods depend on clarity. Kieran smiled at my remarks with the exact smile of someone counting on visibility to silence consequence. He thanked me for my service in a tone that implied he was marking my contribution like furniture in a room he intended to redecorate. Then the ceremonial scissors were handed to him. I stood in the crowd and watched the scissors approach the lanyard as I might watch an electrical arc approach a filament. The motion was theatrical, almost balletic. A teleprompter fed the sponsor's copy about forward momentum. Cameras angled for a close-up. The badge, my badge, the one I'd worn for 15 years, dangled from the lanyard on Kieran's chest, as if it were a prop he had borrowed for the moment. There is a human reflex to reach for something you feel threatened about. Mine was not performative. I did not advance to snatch the lanyard back. The audience reflexively recoiled from conflict in a room that valued optics more than argument. In not split second, I felt the whole architecture of authority tilt. 100 people waited for the cut because they had been trained to expect a photo and a headline and a new Substack to begin. The blades met the loop. The snip was tiny, articulate, irreconcilable. Cameras flashed. Applause began like a starting tide. Then, like a dropped cue, the applause stopped. The moment after was not cinematic in the way a film wants it to be. It was quieter, sharper, and bureaucratic in its own way. My phone vibrated against my hip, an alert I had not expected. On the auditorium's wall screens, a monitoring tile blinked a status change and then went black for a beat. The security dashboard in my peripheral vision displayed a terse banner. Policy-triggered revocation queued. I could feel the humidity of voices on the periphery convert gradually from pride to confusion. I am careful with technical language in public, so let me be clear about what I am not describing. I am not laying out mechanisms or issuing a playbook. I am not giving instructions on how one could replicate protocols. What I will say is this in plain terms. A pre-authorized protective protocol we had registered as a last resort safeguard, one born of long, ugly experience with sloppy change control and political pressure, responded to a set of signals. Those signals were read as an operational dislocation sufficient to justify immediate defensive measures. The system, designed to favor continuity of classified control over theatrical optics, initiated an automated protective posture. In the room, I could see the expression on Lawrence Ashford's face change from mild amusement to something like the weather shifting. Kieran's smile faltered. His mouth opened, then closed. Across the auditorium, people glanced at their screens. Jared, who had been seated near the side, looked like a man who had realized what his role had become in a script he no longer understood. An email notification landed on my phone with the terse header we had never wanted to see in the wild.
Automated Facility Revocation Notice, DCSA alert generated. It was not detailed. It did not explain the nuances of process. It contained identifiers, times, and a procedural flag that matter-of-factly implied we had gone from operational to non-compliant in the eyes of a federal partner. It bore the timestamp 14:07:18, 5 seconds after the cut. What followed was a series of small administrative failures cascading in a way that felt structural. Commitments that assumed persistent access were suddenly suspended. A contract clause that depended on continuous control slipped into a liminal state. Key holders in remote locations found their tokens inertated by orchestration and policy. Again, I stress, I am describing effects, not mechanisms. The important point is that the ceremonial act, the image intended to captivate investors and reporters, had produced an immediate, irreversible signal across multiple audit planes. In the room, a hush fell that was heavier than the absence of sound. The cameras continued to roll because cameras always keep rolling. Photographers snapped stills of a smile that had just collapsed into something else. Someone in the front row whispered, "What just happened?" as if one could ask a theater for an encore and have it granted retroactively. I stepped down from the lectern without further remark. I felt the weight on my chest where the badge had been heavier before the cut, an odd private cleave for an object that had been a tool and a talisman. Lawrence Ashford's eyes met mine for a fraction of a second. There was something like a question there. Were you protesting or were you prophesying? His expression was not pity exactly. It was an evaluation, a recalculation of where authority now resided. I left the auditorium because that was the safest place to think. Outside, the corridor smelled like antiseptic and someone's aftershave. A staffer tried to hand me a sheet of talking points about digital transformation, while an IT person hurried past, sleeves rolled, face pale. I pulled my phone out and checked the time-stamped logs that mirrored my mental timepiece. 14:07:20, automated notification outbound to federal partners. 14:07:31, several enterprise keys entered protective states. 14:07:45, scheduled access change propagated. Numbers and security are not poetry, but they do tell stories. These timestamps, in their blunt numerical way, anchored a narrative none of our press releases could touch. The company had transitioned, without unanimous consent, from a posture of contractual continuity to one of enforced pause. What happened in those minutes would not be repaired by an apology or a polished op-ed. I did not leave in panic. I left in the discipline of someone who knows the immediate utility of distance. I walked back down the stairs toward my office, past the server room where a few engineers had gathered in clusters. They looked at me as if they wanted orders. I had none to offer, but the one I always offer. Document, secure the chain, ensure a paper trail exists for every choice. On my desk waiting was the envelope I had left earlier in the week with a copy of the notarized memorandum. I opened it and found, tucked inside, a post-it scrawled in Miriam's handwriting. "Keep this. If things become complicated, call." I thumbed the paper and felt its innocuous grain like a lifeline. I also received a call from Miriam. Her voice was calm, measured, and edged with the kind of legal calculus that does not wear on the outside. "Do not speak to the press," she said. "Do not volunteer anything you have not documented. We are assembling counsel." I replied that I had already done what I could to create a record. We spoke of the obvious next steps in legal terms: preservation notices, counsel engagement, potential regulator communications. I did not share with her this small, irrational detail that had lodged in my gut, that when the blades met the loop, they had undone more than my lanyard. They had undone, for a moment, a contract of trust. When I hung up, I sat in the dimness of my office and watched the monitors flicker. The hum of the servers was a conversation in frequencies I could listen to like an old radio. For once, silence felt not like absence, but like a shape that would require explanation. We file for evidence because we must be able to prove what happened and why. The notarized memo and the BCCs were crude but effective things. They meant that if there was a witch hunt, if fingers were pointed toward the people who had raised concerns earlier, there would be an immutable trail indicating we had warned in good faith. Documentation does not prevent harm, it constrains the narrative. I thought of the people who would suffer first, the teams on the ground who delivered product lanes and scheduled deployments, families who depended on a payroll that suddenly became uncertain, contractors whose livelihoods were tied to language and agreements that assumed continuity. It is easy to reduce these scenarios to spreadsheets in boardrooms. In practice, they are rows of human faces. I smoked the negligible cigarette of office sugar that afternoon, a coffee and a slice of bakery bread, and considered the choreography I had witnessed. It was the old story in a new dress, a zeal for disruption running headlong into the steadiness required by the work we do. Kieran had wanted applause. He had not intended the silence that followed. There are choices people make that reveal what they truly value.
The board would have choices to make now about responsibility, compensation, and the political calculus of public relations versus regulatory honesty. Some of those choices would be informed by lawyers, some by auditors, some by the quiet, stubborn truth of systems that do not bend to optics. I told myself that day that I would do the work that needed doing, document, secure, and, if necessary, lead the recovery. That was a decision made in the small hours of a Thursday afternoon, when the light through the blinds cut the carpet into bars. But that resolve did not mean I underestimated the scale of what had been set in motion. When a protocol designed to sacrifice agility for trust trips in front of cameras, the ripples travel into contracts and into the minds of partners who ask themselves whether they can count on you. Contracts that teeter on the edge of suspension do not do well in competitive rebids. When federal partners see a protective posture trigger, the first questions they ask are about control and predictability. Those questions, in the defense contracting world, are translated into one metric many executives care about above all: dollars on the table. At Vanguard, the figure was not small. The multi-year program that relied in part on continuous facility access and demonstrated chain of custody resilience was worth, on paper, $5 billion in awarded value and anticipated exercise options. The contract language was dense, the commercial model layered with subcontracts and delivery milestones, but the core was simple. If we could not guarantee certain continuity characteristics, the sponsor had standing to suspend awarding of further options. I calculated in my head, not to gloat, but to orient myself. Monetary impact, dislocation, the human toll. $5 billion was a number with teeth. It was large enough to snap boards into motion, to draw lobbyists and investigators, and to seed the rumor mill. It was large enough that the company's behavior would shift decisively in response. I will stop here with a small, precise image that I have held onto. The badge, severed and lying on the stage under the flood of lights. It looked absurdly small and absurdly consequential. A small object in the right place will change a story. What followed those 5 seconds was not immediate melodrama in the hushed auditorium. It was the slow, bureaucratic turning of wheels, automated notices, council convenings, terse emails, and a board that would have to meet under new lights. My part of the story, at least at that moment, was to keep the record intact, to make sure evidence was not evaporated by spin, and to prepare for a recovery that would be technical, legal, and painfully human. The cut had been ceremonial. The consequences were real. The work to be done would not fit into a single press cycle. It would be months, tedious, intimate, and plain, of undoing and rebuilding.
And at the center of it, a quiet question would persist. What is the cost of treating operational integrity as an accessory to narrative? I gathered my things and walked back down toward the server room. The first alert was a data point. The silence that followed was its shadow. The cameras kept rolling. The story, for everyone but those of us bound to documentation and consequence, was not yet over. But for me, it had already begun to unspool. I opened the door to my office, and the world narrowed to a sequence of administrative imprints: the post-it from Miriam, the envelope with my notarized memorandum, the still warm imprint of coffee on a coaster. Outside, the building had acquired a new nervousness, people moving with purpose that was not quite recovery and not quite panic. The server room down the hall was a cluster of faces lit by monitor glow. Someone had propped the door so the sound of voices could carry. It felt like being inside a machine that had caught someone's attention for the first time in a long while. Miriam's second call came within minutes. Her calm had a new edge. We have a preservation hold going. Counsel's inbound. Do not log into systems you normally don't unless you're preserving evidence. And Aries, do not, under any circumstances, speak to anyone except counsel. Her voice carried the flattened urgency of someone arranging a chessboard under fire. She was already writing the note that would frame everything that followed. Preserve, document, be available. The DCSA notice had landed in my inbox with a terse header and a procedural tag. It was the first concrete sign that the auditorium event had escaped the building and become, for the federal partners, a matter requiring administrative intervention. The notice did not accuse, it declared status. It required a response, an assessment, and the initiation of remedial steps, none of which I was in a position to authorize without counsel. Then the knock. The FBI agent announced himself in the lobby with the kind of protocol that makes certain things real in new ways. He was careful, polite, and blunt at the same time. We're here to understand the sequence of events. We'll need to speak with anyone who might have relevant information. He asked to speak with me. I told them I had counsel. He nodded. He did not push. That was a tactical courtesy, not kindness. They would be back with a formal request. In those early hours, the company that marketed certainty had to do something remarkably undramatic. It had to admit uncertainty. A crisis communication drafted in a panic reads differently than one that understands nuance. Marketing's drafts were glossy and full of promises. Miriam's edits cut it to something that did not overreach and did not attempt to reframe the facts into triumph.
The press release would later be criticized for being too clinical, but in that moment, it was the honest place to start. We experienced a policy-triggered revocation. We are cooperating with authorities. We will preserve evidence. We cannot offer further commentary. The board convened in a room where the art had always been large and the blinds always closed to keep out reporters' lenses. When the directors arrived, the first thing you noticed was how small the executive suite looked under the weight of $5 billion. Chairs were rearranged into a configuration that suggested an inquest rather than a meeting. Lawrence Ashford sat at the head like a title feature, composed, watched, and watched by everyone else. He did not look like a man surprised by crisis. He looked like a man who had built much of his life around the belief that crises could be managed with memos and PR consultants. That belief was under question now. Kieran arrived later, not early as some might have predicted. He drifted in like an understudy called to the stage. His face had the blankness of someone suddenly given lines that had consequences he had not written for himself. In the microphysics of the room, he looked smaller than he had on stage. When Lawrence's gaze met his, it was not an accusation. It was an appraisal. What have you done, son, and can we survive it? The initial board discussion kept circling the same set of realities: the DCSA alert, the suspension of access in certain environments, the potential ripple effects through subcontractors and delivery timelines. Someone, an audit chair who had spent 30 years in defense procurement, said the word aloud that would be on everyone's lips in the coming days: options. Those contract options were the source of the $5 billion number. They were not frivolous. They were tied to milestones, to evidence of continuity, to an implicit promise that the contractor could maintain certain operational guarantees. Once those guarantees were called into question, the sponsor had not only discretion but an obligation to suspend options until uncertainty was resolved. The press followed what it does best. It sought the human drama and the figure to place in the frame. A journalist called me, no surprise, and I declined to comment without counsel. The refusal became a narrative itself, one that fed speculation. Why was the chief security architect being quiet? It's a familiar loop. Silence can be read as guilt or prudence in equal measure, depending on the appetite of the reader. Meanwhile, internally, the company had to decide whom to protect and whom to expose. There were two kinds of risks in those early days: the regulatory and the reputational. The regulatory risk required precision and process. The reputational risk required speed and narrative. The tension between the two is where many organizations fail. They rush statement and then find they have given legal adversaries a map. Miriam understood this. She had the air of someone who preferred the long game. At some point in the first 24 hours, the conversation shifted from immediate triage to an accounting of culpability. That was inevitable. Boards will find a scapegoat if they cannot face systems. A motion was floated: an internal review, immediate suspension, replacement of certain executives, a transparent commitment to cooperate. Lawrence listened to the motions like a man hearing the terms of a settlement in real time. He did not speak much. He took notes in a fine, controlled hand, as if preparing for both defense and explanation. Jared's role became a central, uncomfortable pivot. In private, he was a man frayed by the decision to acquiesce to pressure. He admitted to the board, not in bluster, but with the weary fairness of someone who had been put in a position where the alternatives were all bad, that administrators had adjusted thresholds, and that certain alerts had been muted. He emphasized that he had not formally authorized a bypass of controls, that he had not signed any order to falsify logs, but he had, by his own admission, altered thresholds to reduce operational noise. The board did not relish the discovery. They asked how that could be validated. The logs, if preserved, told a timeline where people had gradually normalized behavior that was, in the aggregate, dangerous. The human dimension here matters. Jared was a good engineer who had been put into an ethical squeeze. When the story hardened into investigation, his family's name would be dragged into headlines and comment threats. That is the ordinary cruelty that trickles down from boardroom decisions. There was an immediate private conversation in which I insisted to Miriam that any disciplinary action consider culpability spectrum and human costs. Our work was not to make theatrics, but to find the truth, and ideally repair the harm without unnecessarily destroying careers. That did not mean there were no consequences. For the company to maintain credibility with federal partners, somebody had to be the face of accountability. Kieran, as the public champion of Project Velocity and the man who had performed the snip, became a lightning rod. Whether that was fair was a complicated moral calculus. He was both agent and beneficiary of a culture that had promoted optics over engineering. He had made a performative choice in a theater full of cameras. Whether his action was criminal was a matter for investigators to decide. Whether it was reckless was obvious to anyone who understood the contract language. The CEO, Lawrence, had to decide how to handle his son: discipline, demote, or defend. Each choice carried corporate, legal, and human consequences. In private, Lawrence and I had a conversation that was short and, like much of what followed, precise. He did not resent me. He resented the evidence. He asked me to help disentangle the technical facts from the emotional performance.
He wanted a path back to stability. I told him what I had told the board in that first meeting. We needed a controlled, methodical recovery and a willingness to accept whatever remediation the sponsor required. He listened, and for the first time, what I perceived in his eyes was not merely guardianship of market position, but a weary acknowledgement that authority has limits. Within days, the DCSA issued a formal request for production of records, and the FBI opened an inquiry that would last months. Those were not inherently punitive instruments. They were investigative. Their arrival, however, magnified every misstep and made every internal decision subject to external scrutiny. The company's external counsel, an older partner with a voice like gravel and a demeanor that suggested every courtroom in the country had made him both careful and wary, advised transparency where it counted and tactical silence where it protected the investigatory process. All the while, the practical problem persisted. The program that constituted the $5 billion option set was now in administrative suspension. Delivery schedules were adjusted, invoices delayed, subcontractors sent notices. The cascade of consequences was not instantaneous, but it was relentless. Small suppliers, those with single contracts and narrow margins, began to feel the pressure first. A week into the crisis, I heard that a supplier in another state had furloughed workers because their monthly cash flow had been interrupted. I imagined those conversations, foremen apologizing, explanations that sounded like thin paper over something heavier. It is easy in a boardroom to talk in millions. It is different to sit with the person who has a mortgage and children and is told the flow of funds has stopped. That human cost hardened something in me. There are moral equations in these episodes that cannot be resolved by technical excellence alone. The money matters, but the people matter more. My role in the days that followed became not just to reconstruct system state, but to shepherd the company through a process that recognized that recovery had to be both technical and humane. We organized a recovery task force. It was, to the outside world, a standard response: technical leads, counsel, audit, and a board liaison. Internally, it was more of a makeshift council of people with a mixture of guilt, duty, and resolve. I was asked to lead the technical recovery because the board correctly identified me as both a technical authority and someone who had preserved a paper trail. I accepted on the condition that our work be collaborative and documented. My terms were explicit. We would not obfuscate, we would preserve evidence, and we would move with the deliberate care required when federal partners were watching. The first and perhaps least cinematic part of recovery was inventory. What did we have that was immutable? Paper records, physical backups, and off-site archives became the lifeline.
There is a myth that data lives ethereally in the cloud. The truth is that for work of certain classifications, it must be anchored in physical artifacts. magnetic tapes tucked into climate-controlled vaults, encrypted drives sealed and cataloged, manifest bundles stored in geographically separate locations. I emphasize that not to romanticize old media, but to remind a broader audience that continuity is a physical logistics problem as much as it is a technical one. One of the cold archives was in a storage facility located inside a dormant salt mine. That phrase reads dramatic on a press release, but the reality is more prosaic. Rows of climate-controlled racks, the low hum of dehumidifiers, and staff who treat the catalog like both history and insurance. For politically sensitive programs, it is not unusual to have cold backups in such locations. The retrieval of those backups is, by legal necessity, a carefully logged act. It cannot be rushed into the light without the chain of custody intact. We arranged a team to physically retrieve the media with auditors present, counsel overseeing manifests, and agents from the sponsor notified of our intent. That coordination took days of negotiation, because any perception of manipulation would be catastrophic. There were moments that felt almost absurd in their mundanity. Signatures on manifests, forklifts moving pallets, engineers in safety vests cross-checking serial numbers with manifest copies, the scent of diesel and cold metal in a subterranean loading bay. The physicality of data struck me then in a new way. It is heavy and tangible. It is wrapped in IDs and barcodes and paper that must accompany it from cradle to analysis. The image of people hauling crates out of a mountain did not match the romantic metaphor of an instant cloud restore. It matched instead the laborious, unglamorous work of proof. We pulled tapes and drives under supervised conditions and transported them to a secure loading bay. Analysis proceeded in parallel with counsel's review. I participated in sessions where we simply read manifests aloud and checked for integrity markers. We were not decoding secrets in public. We were verifying that the copies existed, were properly logged, and could be presented to the sponsor as part of the evidence that the company had not intentionally destroyed continuity, but had, in some measures, allowed an operational state to fracture. Those retrievals yielded a mix of relief and new dilemmas. Some manifests matched our expectations. Other records revealed gaps, missing logs from staging environments, improperly archived snapshots. Where there were gaps, fingers inevitably pointed. We had to be transparent about what we had and what we did not. It is a rare thing to be honest in a crisis, but it is also the most credible posture when regulators ask for the truth. In the weeks that followed, the public narrative morphed. Initial headlines were shorthand. Bad cut, bigger problem.
Then the analysis hardened into something more precise, evidence of administrative tampering with thresholds, a culture of normalizing risky shortcuts, and an executive eagerness to prioritize image over contract reality. Commentators called it performative disruption. Analysts called it hubris. The company's stock, which had for years been a safe harbor for certain investors, wobbled. Shareholders demanded answers. The board convened emergency meetings with investor relations and legal advisors. Lawrence, who had been a steady presence through acquisitions and product launches, now had to field questions about his son's judgment and his own oversight. Kieran became, for a time, persona non grata in the corridors where influence is managed. He submitted to interviews with counsel present. He apologized publicly in a measured statement that acknowledged misjudgment and promised cooperation. Whether that would be sufficient to salvage his career was unclear. Whether it mattered was a separate moral calculus. The company undertook a series of personnel moves. Jared resigned from his post under pressure. Some executives were reassigned pending investigation. Others left voluntarily. The need to show the sponsor and the public that there was accountability was as important as the practical need to preserve technical continuity. The legal landscape shifted as well. The sponsor's contract office issued an inquiry into our compliance with continuity requirements. The company negotiated timelines for remedial actions and agreed to external oversight in some areas. The negotiation was difficult. The sponsor wanted assurance. We wanted time to rebuild systems under watchful eyes. The cost of that time was, in the aggregate, enormous. Options were delayed, some were suspended, and in time it became clear that the $5 billion figure would not be exercised in full. When final decisions were made by the sponsor months later, the company lost significant contract value. The public framing made it a casualty of mismanagement. Internally, the loss translated into hard effects: budget cuts, the cancellation of projects, and a wave of layoffs that cut through teams that had little to do with the incident, yet felt the reverberations acutely. The human toll was immediate and painful. There were people I had worked alongside for years whose emails carried the soft grief of someone packing up a desk they had meant to keep for a decade. Mothers and fathers told their children they were looking for new work. The corridors that had once been busy at midnight emptied.
In the aftermath, there was also a quieter, more precise reckoning. The company undertook a systems audit led by external firms. We invited independent auditors to review change control processes, to analyze logging practices, and to recommend systemic reforms. Those reports were technical, dense, and mercilessly honest.
The findings were not surprises. They were confirmations of a cultural drift that had favored timelines and optics. Recommendations included governance changes, mandatory thresholds for certain classes of change, and the installation of independent oversight for actions that could trigger external contract implications. Importantly, the auditors called for a cultural reset, an attempt to move the company away from applause-seeking to a posture of sober competence. My own role in the recovery was both operational and ethical. I led technical teams to validate the integrity of the archives we had recovered. I worked with auditors to demonstrate that our actions, especially my own precautions and the notarized memo, were made in good faith and in anticipation of the very fractures that had manifested on stage. It was a strange form of vindication that did not feel like triumphs. Validation is a practical thing. It does not make back paychecks or erase public scorn. But it does temper the narrative from one of blatant sabotage to one of systemic failure with accountable actors trying to fix it. During the stretch of months that constituted the rebuild, we labored in what felt like two different timeframes. There was the urgent timeline, meetings with counsel, deadlines for production, audit responses, and there was the slow timeline, the physical work of restoring system state, reestablishing trust with subcontractors, and reconstructing an identity that had been damaged by spectacle. Restoration was incremental. Permissions were slowly reissued under strict conditions. Certifications were sought, and in some cases initially withheld pending audits. It was bureaucratic and humiliating in ways executives hate, but practitioners, like me, recognize as necessary. At some point during a long evening in the war room, a junior engineer asked me, quietly, "Will people remember what we did?" She was speaking not about the cutting, but about the rebuilding. The night spent rescanning tape manifests, the long runs of validation where every checksum felt like a prayer. I told her that memory in organizations is subtle. It is stored not just in press clippings, but in process changes, in new roles, in the way a company budgets time for oversight. It is slow work to change a culture, but change is possible when the architecture of permission is altered. She nodded, relieved by both the practical and the moral contours of the answer. Legal negotiations were protracted. The sponsor, reasonably, wanted assurances and remedies. We offered technical remediation plans, third-party audits, and a willingness to accept independent oversight for a period. Those negotiations did not all succeed. Some options were reallocated to other vendors. The $5 billion figure, nominally still on the contract table, diminished as sponsor leadership took conservative approaches to risk after the event.
For Vanguard Systems, it was a fiscal trauma that reshaped strategic plans for years. Boardroom outcomes included leadership changes. Lawrence, who had long been the stabilizing hand, stepped back from day-to-day operational control to focus on governance. He remained chairman, but the company brought in a seasoned interim CEO, experienced in crisis management and government contracting. Kieran's role was reassessed. He was moved off customer-facing programs and into a role where his talents for vision could be exercised in less risky domains. That was diplomacy more than judgment. It allowed the company to save face externally while removing the central figure whose action had precipitated the crisis. There were also private reckonings. Jared, who had been worn thin by the pressure to perform and adapt, made the decision to leave technology operational roles and go into consultancy, where he could mentor young administrators on governance. He confided in me during his last week that the moral choice he had made, acquiescing where he should have resisted, was not one he would make again. I admired the candidness of that admission. People change careers for many reasons. The shame of a public error is often the most clarifying. Miriam navigated the legal morass with an efficiency that made me both grateful and slightly in awe. Her strategy emphasized cooperation with regulators and prosecutors where appropriate, and firm defense where necessary. She negotiated protective orders, preservation agreements, and the specifics of production that would form the evidentiary core of any inquiry. I will not recount legal maneuvers. They are tedious but essential. What I will say is that her steadiness and refusal to flee from transparency preserved both the company's ability to negotiate and my own sense of procedural integrity. Months turned into a longer season. The company rebuilt systems with external oversight, adopted stricter change control protocols, and made cultural investments,
training, governance boards, and clearer escalation paths. They reallocated resources to ensure that decisions that could affect continuity required sign-off from an independent body. The process was painful and expensive, but it was also, in its core, an acknowledgement. Systems succeed not because of heroic individuals, but because of repeatable, boring processes that make heroicism unnecessary. As the immediate crisis faded into a protracted recovery, I found myself receiving invitations to speak to industry groups about governance, not because I craved the stage, but because there was a need to explain what happens when spectacle runs into systems. I spoke about documentation, about the moral obligations of engineers, and about the physicality of data. I emphasized the human consequences of corporate missteps and urged organizations to invest not only in tools, but in cultures that respect the mundane work of continuity. One invitation came from a government security office.
They had been watching the events at Vanguard as a cautionary example. After months of negotiation, constrained by legal stasis and internal policies, they asked if I would consider joining them in a role advising on industry-wide resilience and contractor oversight. It was, in an odd way, the kind of invitation one hopes arrives after a difficult season, to help fix the systemic problems you had been forced to confront. Accepting that role required a personal inventory. I had loved the work at Vanguard. It had been the platform where I had spent 15 years building and defending systems. The choice to move to government was not an escape, but an attempt to rebuild at scale, to influence policy, to help craft oversight that balanced operational need with contractual realities, and to try to ensure fewer companies found themselves in the position Vanguard had been in. I accepted, with the condition that my move not be interpreted as abandoning the people who had worked with me. I negotiated consulting terms with Vanguard that allowed me to assist in the transition and to help shepherd certain knowledge to the new leadership. When I told Miriam and the recovery team of my decision, the office smelled of late coffee and the tiredness that comes after sustained intensity. She smiled in that steady way of hers and said, "You'll be useful where the rules are written." It was not flattery, it was recognition. I left with a sense of completion and the admission that the work was far from over. The months after my departure from Vanguard were not a neat triumph. The company would recertify certain systems, and in time it would regain some contracts, but it would never regain the precise position it had lost that year. $5 billion is not a number that disappears. It is an echo that changes how a company is perceived by partners, investors, and competitors. There were layoffs, and there were new hires aimed at restoring credibility. The cultural work continued beyond my direct involvement. I watched from the new perch, where oversight and policy are written, and I felt the modest satisfaction of someone who had helped steer a damaged ship back toward harbor, but could not forget those who had been injured along the way. In public, the story settled into a set of lessons that are now, in some circles, the received wisdom. Do not prioritize optics over contracts. Document rigorously. Ensure independent checks on high-risk changes. Those lessons are true in the abstract, but they are easier to preach than to embed. Embedding them requires leadership that is both humble and courageous, willing to tolerate slower timelines and to accept the unglamorous hard work of governance. There is, in the years after these events, an unexpected tranquility to my recollection of that Thursday.
It is not satisfaction in the sense of triumph. It is the quiet acknowledgement that competence, properly exercised, does more than protest work in dramatic moments. It changes process. The notarized memorandum I left beneath a door and the manifest signatures in a salt mine do not make good television, but they matter when regulators ask for the truth. They matter when a family asks why paychecks were late. They matter when a sponsor looks at a contractor and decides whether to place trust. Sometimes people ask me what I would have done differently. The honest answer is that I would have been louder earlier in cultural spaces that reward showmanship and quieter in spaces that require courage to say no. I would have pushed harder for independent oversight before the theatrics began. I would have ensured that administrators had both the authority and the support to refuse unsafe concessions. These are not technical fixes. They are cultural ones that require patience and conviction. There is a final image that I carry, one that loops back to the lanyard and the snip. Months after the event, when some of the dust had settled and a new governance council had taken shape, I visited the company's archive room. In a glass case on the wall sat the severed badge, preserved like a piece of evidence and a talisman. It was mounted on a small black velvet pillow with a plaque that read, in careful type, a date and a short description. It looked more like a museum piece than an instrument of continuity. When I stood there, I thought of the absurdity and the gravity of that small object.
It had been a prop in a spectacle, and it had inadvertently revealed a culture that prioritized media over obligation. There is a temptation in stories like these to end with a moral of pure triumph or pure doom. The truth is messier. Accountability did not come overnight. $5 billion was not restored. People lost jobs and livelihoods. New oversight prevented certain risks but required trade-offs in agility. Kieran's career was altered. Lawrence's stewardship was judged by both investors and history. Jared reinvented himself in a way that honored his talents and preserved his dignity. Miriam's steady counsel ensured that, at least on the record, the company had acted to preserve evidence and cooperate. For me, the move to government was neither a reward nor an escape. It was a continuation of the responsibility I had always felt, to make systems that respect the lives that depend on them. In quiet moments, I think about the auditorium again, the clip of a golden snip, the smell of conference room carpet, the coldness of cameras. I think about how small performative acts can scale into institutional reverberations. And I hold a belief, a professional stubbornness, that competence, documented and patient, will outlast spectacle. That belief is not sentimental. It is a practice. Paper in a file, manifest signed in a mine, logs preserved, counsel involved.
Those are the instruments of trust. If there is a lesson to leave you with, it is this. In organizations that touch critical systems, respect for process is a moral choice as much as a technical one. Honor the boring work. Do the paperwork. Make the notes no one will applaud. Those actions are the scaffolding upon which trust is built, and when trust fractures, it is those traces that will protect people more than rhetoric ever will. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about the hidden weight of operational integrity, please consider sharing it with others who care about corporate accountability. For more detailed notes, sources, and a longer written account, check the description below. If you want to hear stories like this told plainly, subscribe. Thank you for listening.